So, good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Psychology in Our Times. And today, I am very happy to welcome again my colleague and very good friend, Tina Clayton, and also Dr. Anja Botha from Bloemfontein. So, welcome to all of you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Thanks, Brett. Hi, Anja.
So, just a short introduction of Dr. Anja. I actually met her a couple of years ago at the University of the Free State. She was one of the lecturers in the doctorate program in child psychology. And these days, Dr. Anja is keeping herself busy in private practice, where she mostly actually works with young children and adolescents, and also within a hospital context with those patients that have got prolonged stays, etc. I follow Dr. Anja on Facebook, and I'm always so intrigued by her posts around mindfulness and self-compassion. And that's exactly what we're talking about today, self-compassion, and to really get a better understanding of what this term means. So thank you for joining us, Anja.
Pleasure.
So I think a good place to start is this whole idea of self-compassion. These days we're reading a lot about it, and I was wondering if you can just give us a bit of an idea, what does self-compassion actually refer to?
So I think we all are familiar with the term compassion, where you would experience a feeling of compassion for other people who are suffering or going through a difficult time, that desire to relieve what they are experiencing at that moment and to just be there for them and support them. And self-compassion is compassion aimed at yourself. So it's basically how we treat ourselves in times of difficulty, or how we relate to ourselves when things are going bad, when things are challenging, or even when we make mistakes and we have to face our own flaws and our own humanity almost.
So, Athena, we were talking about that whole idea of just thinking about our own inner critic and how we constantly have this voice in our head that can be very hard on ourselves. You've got some thoughts about that, Athena?
Yes, so when Fred and I were talking a little bit earlier about today's interview with you, we were just thinking about how the inner critic is a voice that often is quite useful for us. It serves a very valuable purpose. It keeps us focused on what we need to do. It keeps us motivated. It keeps us striving to produce our best work. So there is definitely a very important place for that inner critical voice that often guides us and helps us to be so productive in our day-to-day lives and tasks. But it does seem that there are times when this inner critic can take quite a punitive tone and can become quite demanding and very unforgiving. And how would you explain the connection between self-compassion and this inner critic, the inner critical voice?
Yes, that's actually very important, because I do believe that all of us have some kind of inner critic. When I speak to children, I often explain it as an inner bully in our heads. And I think that in your adolescent years, even maybe in your young adult years, that inner critic does have a motivational component, and it does help you in life to achieve certain things and to accomplish certain things. But I do think also that the moment you encounter events in your life that you can't control, that you can't fix, where your efforts doesn't matter almost. And moments like these that we're experiencing now with the lockdown and with the virus, where you're sometimes even suffering because of the external events, then that critic doesn't always serve life. Then that critic can become something very harsh or demanding. It can become this attitude of placing a whole lot of expectations on yourself or keeping yourself to very high standards, to the extent that it then doesn't serve your own well-being anymore. So it's very interesting, because there's a lot of neurological research done around this idea of self-compassion and the inner critic. I don't know if you're aware of this, but it's very interesting that brain scans really show that the moment you're critical towards yourself, it literally activates the fight or flight response in your brain. So you almost perceive yourself as a threat in that moment that you're critical towards yourself, and you heighten your own anxiety. Whereas self-compassion is actually the attempt to deal with that inner critic, to almost create a safer inner environment for yourself. And self-compassion neurologically really affects your brain functioning in that it deactivates the fight or flight response and actually activates a whole other part of the brain that's involved with attachment, feeling safe, feeling secure, and just that experience of, as a baby, how you would experience a warm embrace from your mom. Self-compassion gives you that same experience neurologically.
I am really, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking about what you've just said about the very high expectations that a lot of students have of themselves. I think something that we often see is just heightened anxiety and that pressure on ourselves to do well. And I'm just struck by that whole idea that we become our worst enemy in that moment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think also it's a bit of a myth to think that you punish yourself into better achievement. Because often our willpower fails us. So from the self-compassion perspective, we say that willpower and self-control is actually overrated. Because when you perform well, then your inner critic is happy. But the moment you make a mistake or the moment you can't achieve your goals, then it really doesn't serve your well-being anymore. And it's very interesting that the research on this topic is showing that self-compassionate people, in the end, their motivation is more sustained throughout task completion, throughout goal accomplishment, than people who has a very, very harsh inner critic.
I want to pause there. That's something very, very interesting, that reframe on that. That willpower can sometimes actually work against us. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it does seem at the moment as though when I look at Facebook, I see two different groups of comments from people, and I see people posting the comments where they seem to have their full day planned and their day goes according to the plan. They wake up, they have a full family breakfast, the kids are doing their lessons, even sometimes ballet lessons and guitar lessons, and then they do art, and then they go outside and walk the dog in the garden, and then they have family movie nights. And then you have the second group of people who are like, I managed to get out of bed and dress myself and my kids, and what am I doing wrong? And I could imagine, especially now, at a time when there's just this larger event unfolding that nobody can control, it's particularly important not to be almost fooled with those glimpses of perfectionism that other people seem to be portraying. And to really kind of see, firstly, the bigger picture, but also your bigger picture, and to take that step back into that more self-compassionate space where you are feeling a little bit calmer and you're able to connect more with those who are important to you, who are around you.
And that's what I really like about self-compassion. It asks us to do away with comparison, because often we compare our worst moments to someone else's best moments. And it also asks of us to not have some or other hierarchy of functioning or even of suffering. Because I also see a lot of people saying, this is hard for me, but I can't complain because there's people who are suffering more than I do. And self-compassion says there's no hierarchy of suffering. Suffering is suffering. And so you rather check in with yourself and see where you are at currently and how to respond kindly to yourself than to compare yourself to others and say, I should be there, or I should accomplish A, B, or C, or I should be hard on myself, or whatever the case may be. So it's very much based on understanding your own emotions and your own internal environment and energy, instead of comparing to other people who seem to be doing better than you, but actually you don't really know, just based on their social media profiles or whatever.
Yes.
And this is not a competition. My pain is not bigger or smaller than yours. It's my pain, and that I can acknowledge and honor that.
Exactly.
So, Anja, I'm wondering, is this something that we're born with? How can we develop it? Is Is it only for older people? Can young children do it? What's your ideas about cultivating self-compassion?
I definitely think it needs to be cultivated, because I do think in Western culture it's countercultural. Our culture and media and the whole advertising industry focuses on wanting you to compare yourself to others. It helps you to focus on what you lack or what you think you need. And so I think Western culture profits from us comparing ourselves to others constantly. So I see self-compassion as being a little bit countercultural. I do think that it's easier for people who has been parented well to tap into their own self-compassion, because the building blocks of self-compassion is those first experiences with your mother of being comforted, of being soothed when you were a little child. And so if your mom was a loving and a connected presence in your life, I do think it's easier to access that in yourself. But self-compassion can definitely be developed regardless of your past experiences or any earlier traumas that you experienced. Or and it doesn't matter how old you are. I mean, in my practice, I'm starting to teach that to even primary school children. Obviously, on a more concrete level. But I think that there's a sense where we all can develop a kind of attitude towards ourselves. And I would argue that the earlier you do that in your life, the better.
So you think parenting has a lot to do with that? That really fits with my understanding also of the world, that those building blocks of our personality, of our ability to soothe ourselves, it really does start with parenting. So how can parents cultivate the self-compassion in their children?
You would know me, Fred, that for me, one of the most important things is validating children's emotional experiences. So I also think in our culture, we are very ready to fix problems, to be solution-focused in our approach to difficulty that comes along. And it's almost like we've forgotten how important emotions are in our functioning, and to acknowledge and validate emotion. So a lot of my work in my practice, even with adults these days, is to almost relearn that ability to connect with your own emotions. And I think what parents do in those first 5, 6, 7 years of your life is crucial to that emotional development. So it's simply validating what your child is experiencing. If he's angry, to say, yes, you are angry. This is something that I can understand you would be angry about. Instead of immediately jumping to a fix or a solution to the problem, or even punishing your child because they are displaying some angry behavior. So that validation for me is crucial. I think we've forgotten how to just acknowledge our emotions and name it and sit with it for as long as we need to experience it.
I think talking about validating and naming and allowing those emotional experiences is something that really resonates so much for me. And I do think that there has been a shift in our society to try and protect our children so much that we don't want them to feel anything negative. We don't want them to feel anxious. We don't want them to feel anger or sadness or any of these other very natural and very protective emotions. All of those emotions really serve such an important purpose. And again, it also resonates, going back to what you were saying earlier about the mothering styles. And I think when you have such a responsive mother who can pick up a child who's feeling so overwhelmed and is kicking and screaming and crying and is in that moment not feeling good about itself, and just accepting that, like that mess of raw, almost ugly emotions and feelings and almost that wretched feeling, and being able to hold it and to soothe it. And like you say, tapping into that parasympathetic nervous system and just calming it down, allowing that connection to take place. It sounds like it really is a crucial lesson for us to learn. What are some of the things that you do suggest to parents who do step in a little bit too quickly to try and shield their kids from those emotions?
So I can completely understand that instinct. Of course, that's where the compassion comes in again. Of course, we don't want our children to suffer, and we don't want them to experience negative emotions. For me, there are two things that's important here, and when I work with parents. And the first thing is, I don't know if I'm going to be popular if I say this, but I often encourage parents to also sometimes develop their own emotional relatedness and their own emotional regulation. Because I think a lot of times if we want to jump in or to fix situations for our children, it's also a reflection of some of our own emotional struggles or even some baggage that we've carried with us throughout our lives. So I almost want to say as a standard procedure in my practice, I always encourage parents to work a little bit on themselves as well, because the more you attend to your own well-being, the better parent you are going to be. And self-compassion is very much the same. The more you can extend compassion to yourself as a parent, the easier it will be to extend that to your children as well. So that's definitely the first thing that I often work with parents on. Maybe just first start by practicing self-compassion yourself before you even try to teach that to your children or to model that to your children. But then the second thing, the second thing is that I also think this touches a little bit on what you believe about difficult emotions, even what you believe about suffering. Because if you think that emotions are negative and difficult and children should be protected against that, it would be very difficult for you to validate the more negative emotions. But if you believe that all emotions serve a purpose and that all emotions can actually help you towards well-being if you learn to accept them and understand them, if you can make that mind shift, then I think validating all emotional experiences become a little bit easier. So I often teach parents and teach individuals in therapy that I don't like talking about emotions as negative or positive, because negative implies you shouldn't be feeling that. I'd rather teach them to view all emotions as helpful for our functioning, and we just need to learn to understand the emotions and understand what the emotion is trying to make us aware of.
And I think that's that whole idea of we need to parent from the inside out, and that there is no such a thing as a wrong feeling. And I like what you're saying, that all feelings communicate something to us, and it's really about creating that awareness of what is this feeling about. Not just about running away from the feeling, getting rid of it, but really to understand what it is. Because I think we live in a culture where anger especially and anxiety, we want to get rid of it through all destructive means really. And you are saying, let's sit with it, let's see what this is trying to teach me.
And self-compassion specifically is an attitude that says, if I am anxious, for instance, I'm not trying to fix it, I'm sitting with it and I'm holding at it. So Athena, you earlier referred to a mother holding a child when they are difficult, and the good enough mother can hold a happy child, and she can hold an angry child and an anxious child. And self-compassion is exactly that holding of things, holding of difficult experiences, holding of anxiety or anger or difficult emotions, and sitting with it to see what good can come out of it in the end.
What I love about what I'm taking from what you're saying is that, I mean, the phrase self-compassion does seem like it's very self-centered, but it seems as though by practicing self-compassion, am I right in saying that you're actually going to find it easier to connect with others because you're able to understand your emotional reactions so much more clearly, and you will be in a calmer space to connect because it allows you to connect in a meaningful way with others.
Definitely. So I always use that image of how when you're flying in a plane, they always say you put on your own oxygen mask first before you give oxygen to anyone else. Otherwise, you won't be able to help other people anyway if you don't have oxygen. And self-compassion is the same. So if you attend to yourself, if you start to understand your emotional experiences, if you learn to be kind to yourself instead of being judgmental or critical towards yourself, it's so much easier to build healthy relationships with others. I often think that the extent to which we don't judge ourselves will reflect in our relationships, in the way that we won't judge other people anymore, and that they will feel safer with us and safer in our presence and more accepted in our presence, simply because we are non-judgmental towards ourselves and then towards them as a consequence.
I can imagine that as all of us go through our day-to-day lives, I think we all can connect with that inner critic that is very much present. But I think really taking from this conversation today, that connect with that feeling. Anja, any suggestions for how we can develop it? How do we do this? I am hearing two things, that this is not just about techniques. It's a way of being in the world and a way of being with yourself, and also perhaps a way of being with other people. So it's not just about techniques, but are there things that people can do to connect with that compassionate self?
So there are different techniques, and I can maybe refer you a bit later also to a website that you can consult for very practical strategies. But for me, the basic first steps are just what's very common in self-compassion is a step related to heart, a step related to mind, and to action. So the first step related to your heart or your feelings is simply being mindful. So it says at the moment that you are noticing that something's not feeling right or you're struggling, you turn towards that difficulty, you face it, and you just acknowledge it, and you just tell yourself, this is difficult. This is a moment of suffering. This is a moment of confusion, or whatever the experience is that you're having in this moment. So you can see how it would be important for you to be able to name the emotion when you do that. So that is the first step. The second step is then using your mind, and it speaks to almost reminding yourself that suffering is part of life and it's part of being human. So you may be struggling at the moment, for instance, with not being able to see your friends. Chances are that millions of people around the world are struggling with that exact same thing at the moment. And that is quite important to realize, because your inner critic wants you to believe that you are isolated. The inner critic wants you to believe that you are the only one that's struggling. No one will understand you. There's something wrong with you. And so the moment we acknowledge that what we are experiencing is probably a shared human experience, it's almost like you are silencing that inner critic. So that's the second step. And then the third step, the action is, then you identify what you need most in this moment of suffering, and you try to respond to yourself with kindness or gentleness. So if you, for instance, identify that you're anxious, maybe you need to listen to calming music. Maybe you need to go and play with your dog. So small little acts of kindness that actually goes a long way in providing your emotional needs at that very moment. So in a nutshell, it is acknowledging this is a moment of suffering, reminding yourself suffering is part of what it means to be a human, and then wishing yourself well in that moment and taking the action needed to almost providing your own needs in that moment.
I'm reminded, I know you're also a big fan of Carl Jung, Anja, and he said,
Yes.
you know, that which is most private is also most public. That human struggle is a struggle for all of us. It's not just in our own experience. And I really like how you phrase it, to remind ourselves of that truth. And I think that's especially important in the time that we are living right now, to accept what is and not to fight, because I think there's a lot of suffering in that things are what they are, that we're all trying our best to get through it the best that we can.
Absolutely. So it's actually when you resist things that you suffer, when you can be open and accepting towards experiences, you don't need to suffer, because then you can go through them.
That's
It's interesting because I was listening to a conversation with Kristen Neff, who also writes a lot on self-compassion, and she was saying that one of her mantras that she always gives out, and she's now really having to practice it, is happiness is not dependent on circumstances. Happiness comes from how you relate to whatever is happening around you. And it really seems like at this point in time, especially, as you said earlier, no matter how prepared you are, no matter how much you're a type A personality, no matter how much you are a perfectionist, the most we can do here is just sit back and see what unfolds and see what we have to face next together. And there is that common humanity which seems to be coming to the fore at the moment.
Yeah, that's very important.
What I've really taken away from our conversation is also how much this approach, this mind shift, really fosters such deep self-knowledge.
Absolutely. So what is very interesting, and the research is also pointing to that, is that the more self-compassionate you are, the more you create a safe inner environment for yourself. So there's no judgment anymore, there's no criticism anymore, which means you can be open to discover more about yourself. Whereas if you are self-critical, you often become very defensive because you never feel good enough. You never feel like you've done enough or achieved enough. And then your whole defense mechanism system is activated and it closes you off to discover more things about yourself. So we need to feel safe before we can go exploring and discovering things about ourselves and enjoying that process, basically.
Yeah.
We need to feel safe to be able to explore. I think that is a very, very valid point. Anja, I could sit here and listen for hours to you speak about this. Really, in just the way that you're talking about it, I think there's just so much for all of us to take in what you're sharing with us. So thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. Also, when I think of you, I think of wisdom and how you just bring these deep truths and to us. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks. Fred, can I finish with speaking a self-compassionate blessing over all of us?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I'm just putting my hand on my heart because that is a very soothing way to just make contact with yourself. And I just want to say, may we all be healthy, may we all be at peace, and may it go well with us. Thanks.
So may it be. Thank you very much, Anja. If people want to contact you, how can they get in touch with you?
Definitely through my email address, which I will provide to you. And then also I have a professional page on Facebook, which is Anja Botha, Counseling Psychologist. So they're welcome to follow me there.
Great. And if parents have any questions for us or any recommendations for any of our future broadcasts, please contact us at this email address, psych@saheti.co.za. Athena, Anja, it was lovely to share this afternoon with you. Anja, I'm sure I'm gonna knock on your door again soon. I think this is a conversation that we need to continue. And yeah, thank you for sharing your wisdom. Athena, any last remarks from your side?
I've just really enjoyed today. I also wish it could go on for at least another hour. Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us. It's been lovely talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoy this. And I'm, as you can see, very passionate about this. So I would be happy for many more conversations on this.
Wonderful. May you be well, Anja. Thank you so much.
Thank you.